If you're determined to age well, then you, my friend, are in the right place, because that's why we're here, to age well. Bloody well, in fact. Welcome to the Aging Project podcast. I'm Shelley Craft, your host and fellow ager. And in each episode, we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of what it takes to age well, learning from experts around the world and, of course, from each other. Why? Because aging well doesn't just happen, my friends, and each of us needs and deserves a support team. So you can think of us as your tribe or perhaps your cheerleaders. We're here to stand by your side, to propel you forward and spark yes you can choices at every age. We'd love for you to join our growing community. In fact, we're calling it a movement. And of course, try our free 5-day morning challenge over at theagingproject.com. It is a great place to start your aging journey. And this is a great place to kick off today's episode. Brought to you by youmusttryit.com, where you'll find supplements, skincare, and makeup. We've tried it, we've tested it, and we love it. And it's all in one place.
Just now, people are starting to think about metabolic health, and it's sort of coming into a greater awareness. And so it's been quite sad. And I'm not the only person to say this. I've heard scientists say this as well. Like, it's just so sad that we've had generations of people not knowing about this underlying issue with insulin resistance that's kind of causing everything else. And if they could just target that, then everything else would kind of make sense. You know, weight loss would become easier, or just become sort of more natural and effortless, really. And the blood pressure would come down, and, you know, cholesterol would come down, and you wouldn't have to be targeting each of those symptoms of insulin resistance separately. I mean, I guess that's the way I'd frame it. I would say in most cases, weight gain or fat gain is a symptom of insulin resistance and not the other way around, which is a massive paradigm shift.
Metabolic health, metabolism, these are words that are thrown around about connecting with health and longevity. Our experts all talk about it when we're told that metabolic function is critical to our health. But what does that really even mean? So today you'll meet Dr. Lara Briden. Among other things, she's the author of the Metabolism Reset, a science-based guide for women on balancing insulin, losing weight, and improving health. Dr. Lara Briden, we are thrilled to have you with us here at the Aging Project. You have been on our dream list for quite some time, so we're delighted that you could make time for us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Lara, we'd love to talk to you about each of your books. Of course, there's the Hormone Repair Manual and the Period Repair Manual, but we're going to stick to the latest one, the Metabolism Reset. It's coming out on the 28th of May, and I think this topic of metabolic health is so important for all women, but particularly women like us over 40. Can you tell us about creating the Metabolism Reset?
Yeah, Shelley, it grew out of my other work. As listeners can probably tell from the names of my other books, I've been very involved in menstruation, so period health for women of any age. And then my book, Hormone Repair Manual, is for women in perimenopause and menopause. And also, you know, those are the main patients that I've been working with over the last 25 years. So throughout all of that, I was always deeply aware that metabolic health is a critical component of those other aspects of health. In fact, it could be argued that metabolic health kind of fuels or generates all the other kinds of health, including mental health. There's a lot going on right now about the intersection between mental health and metabolic health. I touch on that a little bit in my book, but mainly I'm coming at it through the angle of going deeper into women's health by looking at how our body manages energy, basically.
So you've obviously been working in this space for a really long time, Lara. Was metabolic health something that has come about more recently as something that we need to pay attention to, or have you been seeing little signs of this creeping in over the past few decades?
It's been there for quite a long time. So people will have heard about it if they know about kind of pre-diabetes, or they might have heard about insulin resistance or syndrome X. I mean, these have been things that were, 20 years ago being talked about. And so it's kind of always been there, but it is, you're right, there's something happening, sort of a zeitgeist at the moment where it's sort of finally coming into consciousness. And I think specifically on the words metabolism and metabolic. So I'm happy I chose that name for my book, even though I debated at the time, when I was 2 years ago starting to write this, I thought, well, do people really want to hear about metabolism? Do they know what that means? And of course, today we can talk a little bit about what that means.
And today you're like, yeah, hell yeah, let's put it out there. The Metabolism Reset.
Yeah.
Everybody get onto this.
Yeah.
So you started this particular book about 2 years ago. Is a lot of the research coming from the Southern Hemisphere? I know you're based in Christchurch, or is this worldwide? Or here are we a little bit behind in our knowledge and the research?
I don't think Australia's behind. I was thinking about that. So, I mean, for example, of course, in Australia, I say we because I lived in Sydney for a long time, have the CSIRO. There's Professor Grant, I think his name's Brinkworth there. They've got a few books on kind of metabolic health. And so, and he's, I mean, not just them, but like there's been some research groups in Australia as well who've had their eye on this. But yeah, I would say it's worldwide. I quote a number of the scientists in the book, which is great. So hopefully people can get a sense of who some of the players are and what how they're approaching some of this. And so the scientists are from all over, not just around insulin researchers, but people looking at circadian rhythm and the gut microbiome and genetics, and all of that plays in. So it's a place where scientists from lots of different areas can come together.
I feel like it's the sound of music. These are a few of our favourite things here at the Aging Project. As a researcher and a writer, but also someone who sees patients on a daily basis, I get you've got that beautiful correlation between, yes, the research is backed up by all of these things that my patients are saying to me here in my rooms.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, I learn so much from my patients. I learn, what they know, what the questions they have, the problems they have, some of the emotions they have around this. We can touch on that. But I also get to learn what they don't realize. So I did want to share, this is as a concrete example for your listeners. They might have, heard about something called fatty liver, or maybe someone's been mentioned to them that they have fatty liver. Just my experience with my own patients, which is kind of surprising, but also just good to know. They're not always connecting the dots between the common condition of fatty liver and the common condition of insulin resistance, and how that is really ultimately about metabolic health. So I do hope, between all the the questions over the years from my patients and the conversations I had with them, and then translating that into this book, I hope the book can help people connect some of those dots.
I'm sure it will. Let's get started today. Why don't we start with the title, the Metabolism Reset? Let's start with the basics, metabolism and why we need to reset it.
Yeah, metabolism is about energy. I think that is really the best way to think about it. Even before we get into the, what the blood tests show, or fatty liver, or even anything like that, it's about how the body uses energy. And the thing to understand is that our default setting in human physiology is to be burning mostly fat at rest. I mean, we're always burning a mix of glucose and fat. That's, the two fuels that come into our system. And so the body is sort of toggling between those two. And exercise physiologists have known for generations that when you do more intense exercise, you eventually kind of push more into burning glucose. And that's normal, of course. But what is not normal is, because of two terms, metabolic inflexibility and insulin resistance, because of that common situation, more and more people are kind of being locked out of their own fat burning. I mean, they're still burning fat for fuel, of course, like you never stop completely, but they're being pushed more into relying on carbs, their own sort of glucose for energy. So what that means is, because we, as you can imagine, we have a lot of body fat. Even people who aren't overweight have enough body fat that they could walk. I think the stat is walk between Sydney and Melbourne on just the stores that a normal person has. So it's a lot of energy. And with insulin resistance, you're not as able to access that fat for energy. So people start relying more on glucose. And so that means either eating to keep energy up, which is not ideal, or dipping into our stored carbohydrates, which is something called glycogen, which is also very important type of energy store, but we don't have as much of it. So we're not as, flexible. And this is why people get low blood sugar crashes, potentially one of the reasons. This is why people they can't go for more than 3 or 4 hours between meals. And they just need that sugary snack to keep going. That's a symptom. Obviously that's not our normal physiology. So in terms of the metabolism reset, I'm trying to help people, reset or return to this baseline fat burning, metabolic flexibility state.
Okay, which our body is supposed to be in. And if we are functioning properly on all levels, this would just be something that our body did without us even having to think about. You mentioned there one of the indicators that you perhaps do have a problem with your insulin and the resistance is that you do crave sugar. Now, I would have thought, again, a sugar craving for everyone at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, fairly normal. Or is it that thing? Just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal.
Exactly that. It's common, but not normal. And to be fair, lots of different factors feed into that. The nervous system is very involved in sugar cravings as well. All different parts of the nervous system, including something called the reward system. So there are different things going on. But I think, and what I'm trying to get people to is in an ideal situation with a healthy physiology and with well-timed meals and with enough protein. So there has to be obviously enough food coming in. You shouldn't hit that wall. That nobody should be hitting that kind of sugar craving wall at 3 or 4 p.m. I mean, like I say, I give the advice in my book, if you're truly hungry, have a bit of protein or something, have a charcuterie board or something. Like if you know you're going to be hungry at 4 o'clock, then that's fine. But that's different than needing to.
Don't blame it on a sugar craving. have a good meal instead.
Yeah, well, have a meal instead if you're truly hungry. And sugar cravings, not to sort of minimize what they're like, they can be all-consuming. I know from my patients, they can be very distressing. And so anyone who has been truly suffering with sugar cravings, I mean, there's different degrees of it, of course, but I think that I want people to know that it doesn't have to be like that. There is a way, yes, to return home. I say the road home to metabolic health, to return to the place where you feel peace between meals, where you're able to get the nutrition you need with your meals and then just be relaxed in between and not feel that seeking behavior, the need for food. That truly is possible. And it's not about using willpower. This is where I guess my book is a departure from some of the traditional advice, but certainly I'm not the only person saying this. We can't rely on willpower. We know that from the science. I mean, we can for a little while. As I say in my book, hunger is not under conscious control. You can sort of manage what you eat and withstand cravings for a little while, but eventually, as the saying goes, hunger always wins. So the idea is not to withstand hunger, but rather to recalibrate it or to sort of normalize it. So it's easy to go without snacking between meals. And yet the other thing to understand, one of my big takeaways from diving deep into all the research is that energy expenditure and hunger tend to sort of toggle together. So the brain is controlling all of this. So basically, set point or the regulatory mechanism in the brain, it seems to work that when we are able to reach a state where we feel less hungry, we will also naturally be burning more energy. So those two things kind of go together, which is beautiful. It means we can accomplish a lot of the same ends by, supporting the body to give it what it needs to achieve the opposite of hunger, which is satiety, which is a feeling of satisfaction and having enough energy between meals.
Mm-hmm. So it all comes back to that resetting the metabolism is really resetting our entire system to work as it should. And I know over the years, obviously, research is coming through all the time. Books like this are becoming available. But it really is, I guess, debunking all those myths or the misinformation, disinformation, old research, old news for what's new. And I guess sugar cravings being one of those. Oh, that's just what happens. Women around our age carry weight around our middles to protect our hips when we fall. Like that's just one of those things that we've always heard. And so it kind of gives reason or excuse or just a definition that is perhaps, very outdated as to why we carry that weight around this particular age in this particular spot. So you're saying none of that needs to happen. Here we are to get right to the truths and of course, the newest and latest research that's available. So let's talk about that role of insulin and, of course, insulin resistance and how we would know if we have it.
Yeah. Well, so insulin, and just for everyone to be clear, I open the book with sort of a common conversation I've had with patients where I say to them, look, I think you have insulin resistance. And then they say, oh, no, it's fine. My doctor tested my sugar, my blood sugar, and it was fine. So a very important takeaway is also that you can have normal blood sugar and normal what's called HbA1c, another marker for blood sugar, and still have insulin resistance. So we're talking about the hormone insulin, which is an essential hormone. It's a very ancient hormone, actually. It goes, way, way back in time, and we would die without it. Obviously, it's a very important hormone. It's not bad in any sense. But what's bad is in the state of insulin resistance, where certain tissues start becoming resistant to insulin, but not all tissues. This is, an important factor. And as a result of that, insulin becomes chronically elevated. So chronically elevated levels of the hormone is inflammatory. Not only that, but it potentially prevents satiety, so it increases hunger. That's why abnormally high hunger can be a common symptom of insulin resistance. And also, it directly impairs fat burning, and it directly promotes fat deposition, especially around the abdomen or like inside. So when people talk about belly fat, just to be clear, we're not talking about the like soft under the skin bit of rolls on the belly. That's not what it is at all. The bad kind of insulin resistant belly fat is inside. It's like a hard. It feels quite hard actually, sort of under the rib cage. That's visceral fat. So visceral fat, and therefore circumference around the waist, is a well recognized marker of insulin resistance. There are lots of ways to test it. I had to dedicate an entire chapter to how to assess metabolic inflexibility and insulin resistance, mainly just to give people all the information, but I don't want people to think it's complicated. Straight away, you can start to get some clues from some basic testing that you might have had done. So, well, first of all, there's the increased circumference around the waist, but also high triglycerides, which is part of the cholesterol panel, one of the bad kind of blood lipids. In particular, the combination of high triglycerides and low HDL. So if anyone has sort of noticed that on their reports, that's a common sign. High blood pressure is another sign. And then the other one I will mention, not to be too technical, but people might have seen this on the reports. In the biochemistry part of a blood test that is not done just normally, the GP would have ordered that. There's something called ALT, which is one of the liver enzymes. And if that's in women, if that's above 19, that's also considered to be a potentially marker of fatty liver and insulin resistance. So those are some examples of, easy ways to test.
And if you were getting your normal blood tests at your GP, are these things that we can be asking for? Can you ask for them to check these particular levels? Or again, is that generic, your blood sugars are fine, on your merry way?
Well, like my other books, this book has some sections of how to speak with your doctor about your tests. So I do, especially around the ALT, I have a little box that talks about that. You can ask the doctor, say, well, look, my ALT seems elevated. I understand that means fatty liver. Could that be to do with insulin resistance? And the answer is yes. And there's also some other testing. People can look at something called CRP. People can jot down these. They exist already on the blood tests they would have had from their doctor. And then finally, depending on the doctor, a doctor might be willing to actually measure the hormone insulin. There's a little bit of nuance around all of that testing, but I have some sections about how to, test insulin if you actually want to look at the hormone itself.
Okay. But I love the fact you said it's not the bits you can actually grab here. It's not that extra little handful under your jean button. It's deep inside that you wouldn't be able to feel. And that's where the real trouble is. Some of us carry a little bit around there, but it's getting into that deep belly fat, which isn't necessarily showing on the outside.
Exactly. Yeah, you can't grab it with calipers. It's not jiggly. It's not like that at all. It's deep inside. And to be fair, it's normal to have some visceral fat. We all have some visceral fat, but it's when it becomes enlarged and that sort of distended and hard, then that is in the dangerous category. And I'll share a fun fact with you that, especially in women, the subcutaneous fat, particularly the bum fat, is actually the healthy kind of fat. So there's at least one research study where they found that if someone has enlarged visceral fat, the unhealthy kind of fat, it's actually good if they also have a significant amount of bum fat or subcutaneous bum fat, because that seems to somewhat mitigate or offset the inflammatory effects of the visceral fat. So in a word, bum fat is arguably anti-inflammatory and beneficial.
There's a plus, everybody. Yeah. Thank you for that little snippet there. Yeah, so perhaps don't face front on, face side on in the mirror.
Well, and I have a section in my book called "Don't Break Your Heart Trying to Lose a Big Bum." That is not, that's not, and that actually feeds into the fact that it's cliche, but it's very true. Bodies come in different shapes and sizes. We really do. I mean, some of us carry more subcutaneous fat than others, and especially that healthy bum subcutaneous fat. That's not what I'm talking about with the kind of negative metabolic associations. The visceral fat is quite unique in that way. It's associated with negative health in a way that, subcutaneous fat is not.
Over at You Must Try It, we've discovered so many fabulous low-tox skin and makeup options. Many of our guests have spoken about reducing our overall toxic load, so that has become a huge priority for me. I've slowly moved to low-tox products, and You Must Try It have made it really easy. We only stock low-tox products we've tried, tested, and love at youmusttryit.com. So we have done the research for you. If you haven't visited us already, please stop by at youmusttryit.com for 10% off your first order. What about glucose monitors? Does that go with the testing that we were speaking about previously? Is that something that is good to know whether our glucose levels are high? Does that indicate high insulin or insulin resistance?
Not directly. And I'm in the agnostic camp when it comes to glucose monitors. I know they're very popular. So I do give them, there's a couple paragraphs about them in the tracking section of my book. So I do acknowledge, some people find it helpful just to maybe understand, I guess, how certain foods are affecting them and if they're getting drops in blood sugar, which can also be good, interesting information. But I'm following the lead of some of the scientists in the book who are really saying, we need to stop being so glucose centric, so focus on blood sugar and actually shift to insulin, which is really kind of where the problem, not kind of, it is where the problem lies on this topic is this chronically elevated insulin. And you're not going to pick that up directly with a glucose monitor, although you can sort of see its indirect effect. Basically, with insulin resistance, you're more likely to get sort of a volatile, sharp ups and downs of glucose. But I personally don't wear a glucose monitor. I'm not saying people who do are wrong. I know some people find it very helpful, but also it can be expensive. So I guess what I'm saying to listeners, if they don't feel like they want to spend the money on something like that, then don't. I would say put the money into good quality food or supplements or, a fitness like membership or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so here we go. We want to start at ground zero. We're talking to you today about how we reset our metabolism. Where would you start first thing in the morning when you wake up to get this process going for each and every one of us? Or is it different for everyone?
It is different. I do want to give another just mention to something called chronotype, which is the different body clock. So healthy people, healthy people can vary by up to 3 to 4 hours in terms of whether they're early birds or night owls. And so I don't think there is one morning routine for every single person. I don't think so. No. In fact, sadly, night owls, people who tend to need a slower morning start and maybe do better exercising in the afternoon and naturally want to stay up later, they're more likely to get insulin resistance. And I think part of it actually is they're just not matched well to just the routine of what they think they're supposed to be doing. Like they're trying to shoehorn themselves into like a, early morning HIIT class or something, and that doesn't feel good to them at all. And
so you've almost got to work backwards from that point. If you are insulin resistant and you find that information out, you go, okay, perhaps my routine is not working for me as an individual. Try something else. Yes, there's a lot of trouble. There is shooting going off everywhere.
And it's like, I really just invite people, I survey a number of what I call metabolic obstacles, which are the things that are interfering with your ability to, find your groove with, fat burning the way you're supposed to. And so there are different things for different people. I mean, I'll just give you some big, like high level examples, but one is alcohol. So obviously alcohol is not a major obstacle for everybody, but for some people it is. Like certainly for some of my patients, I'm like, okay, wow, this is the thing. And so we have to, in their case, find a way to mostly get off alcohol. That would be just one example. Another obstacle I talk about, some of these are very practical things. They're not, complicated things, although they're not easy. But another one is just for whatever combination of reasons, not being able to eat home cooked meals. Now, yeah, often that's time. It's sort of, sometimes lack of knowledge or just for lack of information because it's just
can't be bothered.
Just don't like it. I mean, I put my hands up that I actually really don't like cooking. I really don't like it, but it has to be done. And I guess, and this is quite a high level change as well. I just have to say that 70 years ago, people did not have this level of insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction. They just didn't. And they weren't micromanaging things. They weren't wearing continuous glucose monitors or even really going to the gym or doing anything. Like they were just living their lives. And there's a pretty strong scientific consensus that something has gone very wrong with the modern food environment, like very, very wrong on a population level. And so this is why chapter 1 of my book is called Weight Gain is Not Your Fault. I truly believe that. And then chapter 2 is, the great hijacking of the regulatory mechanisms. It's probably not one thing in the food environment. It's a combination of things, but a lot of it's coming from processed foods.
And as you say, we know there's what you want to call it, an epidemic these days of that fast food environment, not getting good calories, not getting good food into your system. And as you say, it wasn't happening 70 years ago because we were taking the time. Our food wasn't as processed. We were taking the time to cook, and we've learned here on the Aging Project all about actually setting your system up for digestion, which means smelling the food, taking time to prepare it. That starts your whole system going. And then when you're eating, sitting down, using cutlery or whatever it might be, taking the time to eat slowly and actually savor what you've eaten and chew like your grandma taught you. So you're saying all of these play into our insulin intake resistance, supply and demand as well.
I'd say that the evidence is pretty strong that, the packaged food is a major driver of insulin resistance. And it's not just takeaway or junk food. It's also things like, I guess I'm in the camp where I also think it's even things like normal commercial packaged bread, muesli bars, sweetened yogurts, breakfast cereals, all of that, even some of which would have traditionally kind of been put in the healthy food category, are, if they're processed, if they contain emulsifiers and not a lot of fiber and high levels of sugar and all those things, that really does put them into the potentially harmful food category. And so this is another nuanced area where the book is partly about this. I've got one chapter about food addiction. I'll just touch on it because it's not everyone. It's about, probably somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 8 people who maybe have been struggling with insulin resistance have some degree of what researchers are now identifying as food addiction. And for them, they do need to make some guardrails or some rules around certain foods. I would say bread might be in that category for some people, where they really just can't, kind of have it or sort of have it or cut back, or they're going to be, for some people, for certain foods, they're going to be foods that at least, have to be off the menu for a while. And that has been quite controversial up until just the last year or two. I just saw someone this morning on social media saying this is finally, we can talk about this now. This everything in moderation is not, the majority of people are starting to understand, that's not going to work for everyone. And in fact, I would say that everything in moderation slogan has historically been potentially quite harmful to some people. But which is to say this, some people can eat everything in moderation, of course, but they don't really have, the hijacked brain the way other people do.
And really, again, it just comes back to that relearning, doesn't it? There's always research coming out, and there's that idea of you need to update. You can't rely on what you thought was right. And we hear it, whether it be potatoes, whether it be eggs, whether it's carbs, starches, sugars, fats. There's always new information coming out. And for you and individuals, of course, you do your own research and speak to your own support network, whether that be doctors, naturopaths, nutritionists. But it really is about keeping up to date because, like you're saying, so many scientists, so many researchers working on this all the time. You can't just say, well, everything in moderation, that's going to work for me, because it may be your absolute problem. As you say, this may be where you as an individual are becoming unstuck.
You are so right about the dizzying just back and forth of different, choruses of people saying, this is bad, no, this is bad, no, this is good. And I totally understand why people are confused. And even now, there's no consensus on some of this. I will just touch on another kind of more controversial part of the landscape right now, which is a big debate around, it's not new, but more further debate around what kind of oils are healthy and which are not. And my look at the research, researching this book and reading the papers and talking to some of the scientists, there does seem to be, I would say, kind of a growing consensus that high dose vegetable oil, sort of the cheap, this sort of corn oil and soybean oil and that kind of thing is seemingly, it's starting to look more and more like that is not friendly to metabolic health, despite, what are we now, like 40 or 50 years saying that we should be having more of that kind of oil. So I do bring it up because I think maybe it's a pretty big piece of the puzzle for some people. And then, of course, people say, oh, well, I don't have corn oil or soybean oil. Like, that's not in my cupboard. It's like, no, but it's probably in a lot of the packaged food that you're buying.
Yes. So it's not what you're actually cooking it in, because we are now cooking more at home again. It's in all of those processed foods that come in packages. Yes.
All the commercial salad dressings, all of that. If it says vegetable oil, it's likely the cheapest vegetable oil they could access, which is likely soybean. Well, in Australia, I mean, it's a combination of soybean and corn worldwide, and
Canolas we have a lot of here.
yeah.
Yes.
And that includes olive oil spreads. Actually, a lot of them are. I was trying to get a reading on what is in these olive oil spreads. They're only like 20% olive oil, and the rest of it is just. They won't even say. Actually, it's just a mix of whatever vegetable oils they were able to get their hands on. Yeah.
So again, if we break this down, you're saying whole foods, as organic as possible when you can afford it. Keep it simple and cook at home. One thing you brought up earlier was hunger, and hunger not being your fault. That it's not one of those things that we can control.
Right. So this is where the first metric comes in. This is how I talk about it in the book. So as you start to identify metabolic obstacles and correct them, and one of them, might obviously, as you've just described, like switching back to whole foods pretty consistently. And that if that was the major metabolic obstacle, if there aren't other ones interfering, then that should result in increased satiety, which is the opposite of hunger, right? That it's just like a naturally increased feeling like you don't need to snack between meals. So I guess I would just say if that doesn't happen after a few weeks or months, if you're still ravenously hungry between meals or getting blood sugar crashes between meals, then there's another metabolic obstacle that needs to be addressed. In your case, for that individual, the switching to home cooked meals is not enough. There might be a gut issue. Actually, I realize of the 10 patient stories, 2 of them have gut issues. So this is very much my naturopathic lens. I know I've said to my colleagues, how many times have you fixed someone's gut and then they drop 5 kilos just without even trying, or that's just sort of often a natural consequence of fixing the gut, because the gut's very involved in hunger and satiety signaling to the brain, which totally makes sense. So
again, how do you fix your gut? You go back to whole foods, eating slowly, chewing.
True. Sometimes you might need an intervention for the gut, potentially. I mean, I have quite a big section. I don't know if you've had guests on your podcast before talking about SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That's a big player in metabolic dysfunction. So if that's present, or signs, symptoms of that are present, then that becomes a priority for helping to improve satiety, lower insulin. Everything we've been talking about today can be influenced by the gut. In fact, a lot is influenced by the gut microbiome. There's this great quote from a microbiologist that I put in the book. He said, if microbes are controlling the brain, then microbes are controlling everything. And that's because we're starting to realize that we as individuals, as humans, we are hungry for the foods that our gut microbiome is hungry for. And that could be the gut microbiome in the small intestine, in the SIBO, which is not a normal situation for the gut.
Okay. So if you're not satiated by eating good foods, it could be you start with your gut. All right. Okay.
Yeah, well, it could be the gut. It could be medication you're on. For example, some types of hormonal birth control can disrupt hunger. I mean, I give a list of about 10 or 12 medications that could be considered. So yeah, so the metric is always, have you achieved satiety? Are you able to have that nice feeling of you've got enough energy between meals, you don't need to snack, you're not getting blood sugar crashes? And if not, then there's something else that still needs addressing.
Mm-hmm. So where's the best place to address this? Obviously, we've had our blood tests, our blood sugars might be normal. Naturopaths, nutritionists, where should we be looking for these answers?
Well, I guess my hope is that people can do some of this on their own. Certainly, certainly they might need to recruit their GP for some of the additional testing that I describe in the book. And the testing I describe, a lot of it is not weird stuff. It's not weird testing. It's stuff that the doctor is quite likely willing to do anyway. Things like around thyroid testing, for example. And then I do have quite a large resource section that refers to other books. Like if someone for example, wants to take a closer look at doing a lower carb diet, I refer out for that. I talk a little bit about low carb in my book, of course, but it's not primarily about that. And then if for anyone who's dealing with food addiction, I provide quite a few resources for that. I would say that's an area where people are definitely going to need some outside support, whether that's from a sympathetic clinician, psychologist, and probably in addition, a group support system of some kind.
Okay, can you give us an example of a patient that you've had and tell us their journey with you along the way?
I'll touch on one that was in the book around something called PCOS or polycystic ovary syndrome. So this is a common condition that it can affect women of any age, often younger women. And so this was someone who'd had a lot of weight gain around the middle. She was having only, three or four periods a year. That's pretty classic with polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS. And, a lot of androgen symptoms, acne, sort of breakouts, facial hair. And so she knew she had insulin resistance from some of the tests that she'd had a abnormal glucose tolerance test, and we did a bit of extra testing and confirmed that she'd had fatty liver, even though she was only 28. And so then she was already doing whole foods, and she took some magnesium. And then in her case, and this patient's story is in the book, we opted for 2 additional treatments or interventions to both improve insulin sensitivity. So in addition to the diet changes, work to reverse insulin resistance and also work to lower androgens. Because in women, excess testosterone or androgens definitely promotes insulin resistance. That's a factor in perimenopause, menopause as well. We can touch on that a little bit after. I talk about that in the book. So in her case, to lower androgens, she used a supplement called inositol, which is one of my favorite supplements, which is I do mention in the book, and I mention it now because it's so safe and inexpensive. And the good thing about it's one of the more easily accessible supplements. And then she also did a hormonal treatment called cyclic progesterone therapy, which can help to reverse PCOS and improve insulin sensitivity. And so she lost the most weight of anyone in the book. I think over about 6 months, she lost about 15 centimeters around her waist. But that partly was because she was only 28 and not 40. Like I say in the book, it's easier you'll lose weight faster at 28 than 48 for sure. And of course, most importantly, she got her periods back. She went up to a 35-day cycle.
Amazing. Well, that is a beautiful story. And look, we wish her all the best now that she knows how to manage that, obviously a little bit better going forward. But as you said, perimenopause, menopause, over 40, we're more interested, I guess, in our health span and our lifespan than perhaps fitting into the old genes, and perhaps we've just given up on that altogether. But it is really about the fact that the stakes are higher and we want to live for as long as we possibly can healthily. Let's talk about how this affects perimenopause and menopausal women.
Yeah, so we're more at risk of insulin resistance during the perimenopause transition. So as estradiol, our main estrogen, and progesterone start to drop away, we get this, and I describe this in the book. We get this sort of relative testosterone situation that is can both promote relatively high testosterone compared to those 2 hormones. It can both promote insulin resistance, and it also contributes to increased visceral fat. So this is why, in fact, the visceral fat, so that fat that we've been describing around the waist, is also the other word for it is called android fat, which is sort of the male type fat. So all of us with the menopause transition will kind of shift more from become less of the hourglass shape with the narrow waist and more of the waist thickening. And that's just part of the normal transition of menopause, but it doesn't mean we have to go all the way into insulin resistance. So I think one way to think about it is that the menopause transition is a window of opportunity to, by making some changes and, changing the diet and eating whole foods and potentially getting off sugar and alcohol, we can really, prevent this progression to insulin resistance. So estrogen therapy potentially can help to mitigate that or reduce that shift to insulin resistance, which is not to say that every single person needs it, of course, because there's lots of other ways to improve insulin sensitivity. And also, if there's anyone listening who is confused by me saying that, the perimenopause transition can be a time of relative androgen or testosterone dominance, and yet they've been told maybe they need to take testosterone. I'll just kind of contextualize that, which is that some doctors are quite enthusiastic about prescribing testosterone for either mood or libido or something like that. And I think I'll just say that can be okay as long as it's taken along with estrogen and progesterone to kind of counterbalance it and not. And then you can avoid by doing that, you can avoid the way that testosterone can promote insulin resistance.
Okay, so if people are recommended estrogen, obviously, or estradiol, whatever it is that helps them through, but having those levels of testosterone are obviously rising, or not rising, but because our other hormones are dropping, it seems more intense within the body. So not everybody needs that, but is it a good thing to have estrogen replacement?
I mean, in general, I think it can be a good thing, but again, not everyone needs it, and not everybody wants it, or not everybody can take it. So I think, but no, certainly not everyone needs to take testosterone. I don't necessarily recommend testosterone at all. Actually, I was just giving it a little bit of, I was touching on it in case anyone had already been prescribed testosterone and was confused about that. But yeah, as you know, I think we're in a time of the pendulum swinging around estrogen therapy. So when I started practicing as a naturopathic doctor back in the mid 90s, it was super everyone was supposed to be on estrogen to prevent heart disease. It was like very, very enthusiastic. And that was sort of around 96, 97. And then, of course, in 2001, with the Women's Health Initiative, which was a controversial study, I realized that then there was a real fear of estrogen and kind of a swing away from it. And now we've been swinging back to it very enthusiastically in some circles. And I'm a little bit more just sort of in the middle. I think it can be helpful for the right person, but it's part of just one tool in many. There's lots of other ways to feel better through the menopause transition, and there's lots of other ways to prevent those long-term risks. The long-term cardiovascular risk or heart disease risk, and probably the dementia risk to some extent associated with menopause, is almost certainly because of the shift to insulin resistance. So this is how important insulin resistance is. And I hope, I know we talked about how the word metabolism or metabolic health is becoming a lot more mainstream and people are understanding that. I really want the term or knowledge around insulin resistance to become sort of more understood as a central component in not only weight gain, but in everything we're talking about here, like all the cardiovascular and other risks associated with metabolic dysfunction.
So you gave us a few clues then as to how we would know, perhaps, if we were moving towards insulin resistance. But testing really is the only way to know for sure if that's what your issue is.
Yeah, well, it's what we talked about before. So it's the solid kind of under your rib cage, thickening around the waist, not the jiggly kind, but the inside the abdomen kind. That's probably the number one symptom of insulin resistance. And then the other tests I mentioned earlier, like the triglycerides and ALT, maybe testing insulin. There can be a few other signs. The other physical sign of insulin resistance is something called skin tags, which I mentioned in case anyone has it. Like they're little, just flesh-colored, like usually on the throat or under the armpits and that sort of thing. And that's a really classic sign of insulin resistance.
Yes, and they'll just grow out of nowhere.
Yeah, people sometimes just get them snipped off. Like they're small, right? They're just little tags. You might have, I think we've all maybe seen people who had those. That's usually that's a sign of insulin.
Great telltale sign.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, and that if you suddenly move into insulin resistance, you'll see an increase in those, or you'll actually see some appear that weren't there before.
You might see them appear, but that's quite severe at that point. So you can have a milder version of insulin resistance and not have those. So I think hopefully the idea is to catch it early, right? And reverse it early. And I guess a good finding would be, it's very reassuring if, for example, your triglycerides are low on a blood test. That's good. Or your CRP is low on a blood test. Those are all very reassuring signs, probably, that you don't have insulin resistance.
But ultimately, check in with the Metabolism Reset. There's some incredible science-based research in there, of course. This is a guide for women on balancing their own insulin, of course, losing weight and improving their health. And Lara, you've got it all there in the book, and you're saying we don't necessarily need to go out and seek help right now. We just need to work through this and reset ourselves. And then if we need to reach for more help, there is, of course, practitioners out there ready to hold our hand and get us through it. But you've given us some wonderful tips today. And of course, the other books that you've got there, the Hormone Repair Manual, of course, that's for healthy hormones after 40, and the Period Repair Manual for anyone who's a bit younger than that and would like to get their cycles back on track. It's an amazing contribution and work that you do. It must be incredibly rewarding when you see your patients on a healthy road.
Yes. I mean, and actually, I wrote just to share on a personal side of things. My first book, Period to Perimanual, I just wrote for my patients. I really just thought it'd be my patients reading that. I wrote it to try to help them and then make our consults more efficient because they would have this level of literacy around their own health. And so I'm very pleased that it's helps. It seems to help so many people around the world, which is really exciting, really good.
And have you sort of written these books for each stage or period of your life? Do you feel like now you're heading into perimenopause, you're a lot more interested than you were 10 years ago?
That's a good question. Well, I'm through perimenopause now, so I'm mid-50s. So that's behind
Congratulations.
me. Yeah, exactly. I graduated into menopause a few years ago, so that's all. Yes, I think I did write my perimenopause book during the peak time of my perimenopause. I think I was interested in that. I think, like I said, I think for this book which is essentially about insulin resistance, it just grew out of just my observation over the past 25 years with patients of how central it is to um, people's health. A lot of people, not everyone, probably about half of people have some degree of insulin resistance affecting them at some point in their lives. And also, there has been just sort of a lack of knowledge about it. Even as even though we've said a few times today, it's just now people starting to think about metabolic health, and it's sort of coming into a greater awareness. And so, it's been quite sad. And I'm not the only person to say this. I've heard scientists say this as well. Like, it's just so sad that we've had generations of people, not knowing about this underlying issue with insulin resistance that's kind of causing everything else. And if they could just target that, then everything else would kind of make sense. Weight loss would become easier, or just become sort of more natural and effortless, really. And the blood pressure would come down, and cholesterol would come down, and you wouldn't have to be targeting each of those symptoms of insulin resistance separately. I mean, I guess that's the way I'd frame it. I would say in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, weight gain or fat gain is a symptom of insulin resistance and not the other way around, which is a massive paradigm shift. So there has been this idea that you gain weight just because you ate too much, is sort of the idea, the old narrative. And then from that, you become insulin resistant. But that's not what the science shows. It actually shows the insulin resistance probably comes first in a great many of cases, and then drives fat gain. Not only drives fat gain, but actually, creates this reduced ability to burn fat for energy, which makes people tired and blood sugar crashing and feeling hungry all the time.
And around the circle goes. Again, we
Yes.
never get off the roundabout.
Yeah.
So what do we do, Lara? What's the one thing our audience can do today to improve their health along these lines?
I guess the one thing I would say is just know. I know this is not quite, you're looking for a more action-based one, but I would just say know that it's not normal to feel hungry all the time. Like, just know deep in your heart that if that's what have been experiencing, that is not normal. There is another way. Your body can reach a different way of being, and you should never, ever, ever, ever have to be fighting this with willpower all the time, because that would just be, well, that's exhausting. And that's one of my biggest takeaways from the book, actually, is just how sad I feel for people who've been exerting willpower for decades and failing at that because no one can win at that game. And it's hard. And I admire their tenacity for, keeping going. But there is a different way. It is possible to have more energy and feel less hungry.
Lara, you mentioned that insulin resistance can have a high impact on perhaps the development of onset of Alzheimer's and cardiac health. Can you explain a little bit about that, how that works?
Yeah, insulin resistance is a major driver of cardiovascular risk. So high blood pressure, increased risk of stroke and heart attack. It's sort of a known driver of those. And in terms of dementia, insulin resistance is one of several drivers, as listeners may know. There's actually different types of cognitive decline or dementia, but insulin resistance is involved in some of those. So, it can be an important way to reduce the long-term risk of that condition.
We do get worried about that extra weight that we carry, whether we know that it's that deep down belly fat, whether it's just the visceral fat. And of course, there is ways and means about getting rid of it that we hear a lot about. And of course, Ozempic is the most recent one, I guess, the most prolific one around at the moment. Have you got any comments on that usage?
Yeah, well, I talk about it in the book. So, what's interesting through my scientist lens about that whole category of medications, the GLP-1 agonists, including semaglutide and some others, is that really how much they confirm about the brain's regulatory mechanisms. So those medications, they work on different aspects. They slow stomach emptying and a few other things, but they primarily work on the regulatory mechanism in the brain, and they dramatically increase satiety. And remember I said earlier that satiety often goes hand in hand with increased energy expenditure. So those medications are actually shown to increase energy expenditure as well as reducing hunger. So I just think, I have a couple of patients who've tried them. I shared a couple of those patient stories in the book. I want my patients to feel better. So if they want to try them and it's working for them, then I'm supportive of that for sure. But I think, I guess more broadly, I just think the success of those medications really speaks to, at least through my lens, the success of this kind of approach of supporting the brain, like I talk about in the Metabolism Reset, sending your brain all those signals of safety and satiety that can naturally help that brain regulatory mechanism dial down hunger and dial up energy expenditure. So, and as to what the future will bring with those medications, it's hard to predict. I suspect there's always going to be some people who use them or something similar, but I suspect a lot of people will find ways to do it without them.
What we're talking about today is ways that we can do it without them. But of course, it seems like a shortcut to the solution that people are searching for, which is less fat.
Yeah, I guess I haven't thought about it in those terms as a shortcut. I'm sort of, like I said, I'm sort of just wanting people, especially because originally those medications were approved to to treat diabetes and reduce exactly some of the metabolic risk that we've been talking about. So if it can, reduce that risk for people, then I think the medications have a place. We just don't really know about their long term. They have been around for a couple decades actually already in terms of treatment of diabetes, but in terms of their long-term effect on the brain, just to say again, emphasize again how much they work on the brain. And here, there's a quote from one of the experts in my book, just kind of wondering about that and how, there seems to be some evidence that the medications reduce desire and compulsion for other behaviors, including drinking and even other types, substances. So, and they also there's some concern that at least for some people, they may even reduce desire for kind of life in general. So they can have mood side effects. So yeah, I haven't come down on a position of being strongly pro or anti them. I think they're interesting from a scientific perspective. Because I'm a naturopathic doctor, most of my patients are not interested in taking them anyway. So I haven't really had to, I guess, confront that question.
Mm. And like, of course, of any sort of medications, as long as you're doing it safely and under the guidance of a professional, then completely up to you. You mentioned one in there, Inositol. What is it? What does it do?
Inositol is one of the better research supplements out there for insulin resistance. It's been researched both for PCOS, women with PCOS, and women in perimenopause, menopause for insulin resistance. It's been clinically trialed in humans for that and found to be effective. So I have quite a big section in my book about inositol. It's one of 5 what I call missing metabolic nutrients that I feel are safe to take, safe to kind of bring back, give the body what it needs. And I guess the beautiful thing about inositol is it's very inexpensive and it's very safe. I always feel like I'm doing like an infomercial for it right now, but for what it's worth, I do not sell inositol. You can buy it almost anywhere. So I'm just a fan.
But you wouldn't take it unless you knew that you were insulin resistant, or is it something that we should introduce to our diets anyway? Are we missing it somewhere else along the food chain?
Well, that's a very good question. What are we missing? I would say with our modern food supply, we're missing quite a lot. Yet I always stop short of saying every single person should supplement. I never make blanket statements about everyone taking stuff, but inositol is pretty popular for other things too. Actually can support sleep and mood to some extent. So we used to get it. If your listeners are interested, we used to get most of our inositol from organ meats.
Okay. So this is going back. Okay. Now I love the Aging Project because I learn so much, and it all now filters down and finds its little spot in my brain. So this goes back to us, yes, eating more pates, eating more of our rich iron meats, and that sort of thing. Innards.
It goes back to how we're cut off from our traditional food supplies. So I don't know when you were a kid, but I often share when I was a kid in the 70s, liver and kidney were on the rotation. Like we were served those. That was like, okay, it's Friday night or whatever, we're having liver. But like, I don't think people do that anymore. At least not the people I've talked to. It's just really gone.
I'll share a little story with you. I did have a sleepover once at one of my mum's best friends, and if she's listening, which she is, you know who you are. She put kidney and liver in our spaghetti bolognese, and I've spoken about it with my mum ever since. I'm talking 40 years of suffering here, going, oh my God, I ate liver. But now I love pate. So I get my liver content. I don't mind sitting down to a whole jar of pate now. And I've been told it's good for me. So I'm feeling better about that.
Mm-hmm. Organ meats are very nutrient dense. It's not just inositol. It's another nutrient called choline, which I talk about in the book a little bit. So yeah, collectively, we're missing some of those nutrients now, sadly.
So where else could you get that from if you're not a big liver eater?
Inositol. Well, actually, weirdly, there is inositol in plant foods as well. Certain types of fiber can break down into inositol, but it's not as absorbable or as good as the kind you can get from organ meats. It's and the body makes some too. So like actually some of those essential nutrients, not essential nutrients, they're not essential if the body can make them, but some of these nutrients these missing metabolic nutrients that I talk about in the book, we can make to some extent. So I think there's been this kind of thinking, well, sure, the body can make a bit of inositol, so it'll all be fine. But I think what, science is showing us, or what the results of some of these clinical trials have been showing us, that obviously it's not fine. Like obviously giving back that nutrient can, help people.
A quick break in today's conversation, and I know you'll be interested in this one. In my chat with Dr. Lara Briden, we learned inositol is one of her favourite safe and inexpensive supplements to improve insulin resistance and aid weight loss. She also spoke of the benefits for PCOS sufferers. In the podcast conversation, Dr. Briden told us inositol has been researched for women in perimenopause and menopause for insulin resistance and been clinically trialled and found to be effective, and is one of 5 missing metabolic nutrients that women need. This is the reason why we've always stocked inositol over at youmusttryit.com. So ladies, if you're worried about abdominal visceral fat, search for inositol over at youmusttryit.com before they get snapped up. Right, now, back to Dr. Briden. Lara, obviously being insulin resistant is going to show up in many forms, and one of those that you will see is inflammation within the body, sore joints, just feeling achy all the time. Is that a real indicator?
Well, there's a very specific type of inflammation associated with insulin resistance, downstream from insulin resistance. It's called metabolic endotoxemia. People don't have to remember the name, but yeah, it's associated with high CRP as one of the blood tests that I mentioned before. So it's this kind of low level of inflammation that could show up as a little bit of joint pain possibly, but it's more just a generalized inflammation. It's not the same as, for example, some women get like an autoimmune type inflammation, sometimes flaring up joints. That's not the kind of inflammation associated with insulin resistance.
Okay, so achy joints isn't a sign.
Well, no, I wouldn't say it's not a direct sign of insulin resistance, no. Although people with insulin resistance could have achy joints for sure. Actually, another big sign, which I'll just mention, is sleep apnea. That's actually quite a common one as well. So if any of you have ever had a guest talk about sleep apnea, it tends to go hand in hand with insulin resistance. Like so many things with insulin resistance, it's bidirectional. So with sleep apnea, insulin resistance causes sleep apnea as a symptom, and sleep apnea worsens insulin resistance. And also with inflammation, insulin resistance causes inflammation, and inflammation worsens insulin resistance. So it's very entwined.
So we've really just got to get all our ducks in a row. And that's about taking control of your own health, isn't it? And as you said, we've got all these wonderful practitioners out there ready to help us from all different modalities. But it really is about listening to your own body and knowing what you need and looking out for those signs. And of course, starting back at the very beginning and not using any excuses to do the things that we know now are right for us. There may be some outlying factors. There may be some outlying issues, but if we get all of those simple, basic things right and into our everyday, and Lara, it feels like such a big deal, but ultimately we talk here a lot about baby steps, just little changes every other day, making different changes, and a year down the track, you won't really recognize yourself.
Yeah, and it should feel good. I do emphasize this in the book. Like it should generally feel good. There should be an increased, what I call zest early on in the process, satiety and zest, which will keep you going. And the other thing to acknowledge, very important, people are going to stumble. People are going to be super enthusiastic, be like, that's great. I'm going to cook at home every day. I'm not going to stray from that. I'm going to quit alcohol. I'm going to quit sugar. And then sort of do that enthusiastically for a few weeks. And then boom, life gets busy and you sort of just have to eat out and you just kind of go back to what you were doing before. And that is totally understandable. This is actually, I hope this comes through in the book, because I do acknowledge this. I talk about this a bit, is that the key at that point is 100% not to think, oh, well, that failed again. I tried and then that failed. It's actually to be like, okay, that's normal because I'm human and my life is busy and we're all of us used to eating what we're used to eating. It's hard to change that. So I will just, yep, that's fine. Forgive myself, just get up and keep going. So that's a critical part of the learning from stumbles I talk about in the book.
Yeah. And look, I say it a lot here and I say it to myself all the time. The amount that I'm learning and the amount that I now know, it's very hard to ignore that or unlearn that. So it's always there in the back of your mind. And yes, as you're reaching for that chocolate chip cookie because you just can't help yourself, that's okay. But you know better and you'll do better next time. Or maybe you'll only eat half this time and save the rest for tomorrow.
Or maybe someone has food addiction. I'll just have to put that in there as well. And in that case, that requires more. That requires help.
As you say, you are over the perimenopause, Jenny. You are now free and easy. What does aging well mean to you?
Yeah. Well, for me personally, it's about, because I'm an avid walker. Like I seriously love walking. It's going like bushwalks or just for one day or for multi-days if I can. And so for me, it's about being able to keep doing that, I think, and staying outside. Actually, in fact, in Hormone Repair Manual, I do talk about for me, perimenopause, I got this stronger urge to go outside, go camping and spend time outside. So that's been part of it for me, which maybe goes along with, playing a bit more, engaging with the world. I hope most of us, not all of us, but many of us by this point in our life, maybe have a little more free time we can dedicate to that.
Absolutely. Lara, it has been a pleasure having you on board with us here at the Aging Project. I know that our community is going to be reaching for all of those books, but of course the Metabolism Reset is the new one that is out May 2024. Very exciting. Have you got another one on the cards? Are you working on anything at the moment?
Well, I have an idea, but not sure yet. I'm just, at this point, I'm just all about this book for a little while, I think.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations, because I know it is like having another baby, isn't it? Getting it out there. And of course, everyone can follow Dr. Lara Briden on her socials. Your Instagram is a wonderful resource on so many topics that I'm sure our community will deep dive into that. Lara, great to meet you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, Shelley.
Hopefully, after today's episode, we can finally debunk the myth that moving more and eating less is the key to managing abdominal weight gain. Clearly, there is so much more to consider. Insulin resistance, gut health, medications, and our unique hunger set point all play a significant role. To quote Dr. Lara Briden, weight gain is not your fault. It's sad to think that women of past generations have blamed themselves. So many women experience abdominal weight gain during perimenopause and menopause without understanding why. Now you know that insulin resistance might be a factor. Given the significant health implications of metabolic dysfunction and insulin resistance, such as cardiovascular risk, stroke, and dementia, it's clear that abdominal weight gain is not just about fitting into a dress and looking good. It's about your health span and longevity. In society, we've been taught to trivialise weight rather than recognise its significance as a health issue needing expert advice. I'll be picking up Dr. Lara Briden's book to learn more. It's a great read. A reminder that the title is The Metabolism Reset and it is out now. I'll leave you with Dr. Briden's reminder that perimenopause and menopause are a window of opportunity to make changes to our diet, sugar intake, alcoholic consumption, and focus on whole foods. These changes might help prevent the progression to insulin resistance. Thank you, my friends, for joining me once again. I'm Shelley Craft, and this has been another episode of the Aging Project podcast. I'll catch you soon. A final thing before I go. If you enjoyed today's episode, can I ask two small things of you? can I ask you to share it with someone you love? We would be so grateful for your support and help to spread the aging well message far and wide. We want everyone aging well alongside us. And if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the podcast, it helps more than you know and means you'll never miss an episode. Thank you so much. Until next time, I'm Shelley Craft, and this, my friends, has been another episode of The Aging Project. As always, the Aging Project podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes. Always seek medical advice from a qualified practitioner.